as well, but unfortunately couldn't make it. But stepping into the breach at very short notice is Aimée Christensen, who's here in the middle. Because she's not in the book, Aimée's a Cato Fellow here, and has an advisory firm on many issues that are going to be discussed here during the forum. Department of Energy, companies like the Virgin Group, Duke Energy. Was in Copenhagen for probably, I don't know, would you say 3 long months or 3 wonderful months?
Cold and dark months.
ahead of the summit that we're about to discuss. Used to be at google.org doing energy strategy. So lots of wonderful things, and I've only scratched the surface of her long and wonderful resume. Just to my left, your right, is Richard Heinberg, Senior Fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute. You want to know anything about peak oil, this is your man. You may have been sitting in a big darkened theater watching the Leo DiCaprio's 11th Hour movie. That's the guy over here. And over on my far left, to the right of the panel, is Bill Antholis, Managing Director at Brookings. He really does everything. I mean, everything. You name it. Whatever your policy or foreign policy issue, he's the man. But has a particular expertise in this particular area of energy policy, climate change, and is co-author of a book which I read on the way here, and I commend it to you, authored with Strobe Talbot, Fast Forward, Ethics and Politics in the Age of Global Warming. It has a fantastic chapter, by the way, on the drama of the Copenhagen summit. Since it's not a giant room, can we just like fly around the room really quickly and you introduce yourselves and just say, you know, your name and, you know, whom you represent or where you work? We don't want to take tons of time, but I'd love to know who you all are, starting with you, please.
I'm CEO of a company called Water Standard. We're in desalination offshore.
I'm Pat Mulroy. I'm the General Manager of the Singing Nevada Water.
I'm Joel Fetter. I'm an attorney who's undertaken to study climate change in Pennsylvania here. And I'm doing a lot of lecturing on the subject.
Hi, I'm Jacob Scher. I'm Director of Global Strategy and Advocacy for the Natural Resources Defense Council.
I'm Corina Murafa and I'm from Romania. I'm a scholar present here at the Environment Forum, and I'm also doing graduate studies in energy policy in Germany.
Patricia Conklin. I'm the director of the Alaska Native Science Commission in Anchorage, Alaska, and also the chair of the Indigenous Peoples Global Summit on Climate Change.
One person in the back, I think some of us know him already. I think it's you, Strobe. We'll go at the desk and then we'll go in the back row.
Janet Ignacio, I'm with ICF International, which is a global energy and environmental firm. I run their transportation line of business.
Sherry Miller, I'm the Executive Director of Post-Carbon Institute. I work with Richard over there.
My name is Mattia Cavana. I'm a scholar here. I'm work for the Italian Aerospace and Defense Industry.
I'm Carlo Papa, the Adult Chairman Office of NEL. It's a fairly big utility company operating worldwide.
I'm Amanda Reed. I work with the CEO of the Nature Conservancy, Mark Tusick, and I'm a scholar here as well.
We'll go actually to the back row and then we'll...
My name is Christine Benedetti and I'm a writer covering for the Aspen Institute.
I'm Laura Mahasini, scholar, and I work in the field of living architecture.
Living
Bruce
architecture.
Chapman, I work currently with WWF and EDF, among other divisions.
Cody Radlich, I'm an audio engineer at Citizen.
Brian Fagan, I'm an archaeologist from White.
Leslie Schmidt, I write for Examiner.com and I edit for Environmental Physicists, National Center for Environmental Research.
Hi, Siobhan Farry. I work behind the scenes and strategic consultant to the CEO of the Community Science Foundation based in Washington, D.C. It has a large broadcast team that's developing a national show on energy and the environment.
Sir?
I'm Munjid Sharif from Jordan, and I work with the United Nations. I run the program on climate change adaptation in Jordan.
My name is Lyra Luis, and I'm a principal architect of my firm in Chicago, and I'm also part of the American Institute of Architects, the Royal Institute of British Architects, professional?
I'm Joe Dufresne. I'm a business student from France, and I'm currently interning in sustainable management consulting.
I'm Molly Ward. I'm a graduate student at Duke University studying energy and climate change, and this summer I'm working for Aimée at the Rocky Mountain Institute.
I'm Jin Kyung from Building and Construction Authority, Singapore.
John Kyung. I'm also from Singapore, Building and Construction Authority. In recent years, we've been giving green buildings a big push in my city.
Hi, I'm Scott Fitzwilliams. I'm a scholar here. My job is the forest supervisor of the Whitewater National Forest, which is the 2.5 million acres surrounding Aspen.
I'm Surya Dundar from Nepal. I'm a lawyer, but I work in the area of public utility and aggregation going on. I'm Satish Kumar, working for Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia.
Peter Reiling, founder of a company called Amherst. We develop drop-in biofuels and chemicals, so work with existing infrastructure.
Wow, with all that expertise on that side of the room, we could reverse this role very, very easily. We're going to talk amongst ourselves, hopefully for our collective benefit for a while, and then I'm going to moderate a session where you ask your questions. It will not be 10 minutes at the end. We're going to devote 25 minutes to 30 minutes for your questions to guide the discussion. I happen to have the last television interview with the legendary author Kurt Vonnegut. And he's a wonderful guy. He's very funny, of course. He was sadly suffering from emphysema. He said he was going to sue the tobacco companies because for years they were threatening to kill him, yet he was still alive. He proposed marriage to my wife, who came in for the interview that day. But on questions of policy, despite the kind of joie de vivre that he seemed to have in his demeanor, on questions of policy and the future of the earth, he was rather downbeat. His thesis was that the stuff that had powered everything, in his words, that was razzmatazz about our society, fossil fuels, is running out. And he says, this is not a very scientific observation, but I think it resonated with our audience, that the Earth was going to develop, or had already developed, antibodies to us, to humans, and was going to slough us off eventually because of what we've done to it. And his key point was he thought it was already too late for the Earth. He thought it was already too late. Which brings me to Copenhagen. Let's talk about the big UN gathering that took place in December of last year. There was a lot of work that led up to this meeting that was designed to figure out what we're going to do once the Kyoto protocols run out in 2012. It was also used as a catalyst to mobilize international public attention on some of these issues. Many, tens of thousands of NGOs also pushed for a voice at the table, and in a way that the organizers were not fully ready for. There is a tendency to see what happened in the end as some kind of abject failure. Let's find out what our panel thinks about that. Richard, let's just start with you. I mean, we're going to ask the same question of all the panelists just to kick it off, which is, what's your appraisal, broad brush, of what was or not achieved there?
Well, I have to preface what I say with a little caveat in terms of my expertise. I'm not a climate scientist, and I wasn't at Copenhagen. I'm a writer. I was watching it from a distance. But from my understanding of the issues and what was at stake, what was needed, it was clearly a failure. What we needed was a cap on CO2 emissions to be agreed by the world's nations. And that really should be 350 parts per million. I think the latest climate science is pretty clear on that. But we didn't even get an agreement to 450 ppm. We got a sort of milquetoast agreement that in the form of the accord that came out at the very end of the gathering, that we shouldn't push the Earth's climate any further than 2 degrees warming Celsius. But there was no clear mechanism for achieving that was agreed on. There was no target date for a peaking of greenhouse gas emissions agreed in the accord. There were no emissions targets for 2020 or 2050 in the accord. And it was just an accord. It wasn't a binding agreement settled upon by all of the nations that were there. It was just a sort of last-minute backroom agreement that was cobbled together among a few key nations, including the U.S. and China. One could say, I guess, that's better than nothing, and fair enough, but it wasn't nearly what the world actually needs.
Maybe you were there, putting your sweat into all this. You ready to write it off completely?
No, absolutely not. I think that there were 2 aspects of it. There's a substantive success or failure, and then there was also communication success or failure. And I think that the substantive, I would say, there were some pieces of it that were a success, but certainly not what the science requires, absolutely. And then I would say communications, it was an absolute failure as far as the public understanding what was happening there, what was at stake, and where we need to go as a globe. It was very easily written off. And actually, although the accord itself didn't have those commitments, the countries had to sign on by January 31st and make those commitments in order to work towards that 2-degree target, which by 2015, they're supposed to assess whether they can get down to 1.5 degrees, whether the science requires that they get
There's
down to
about 130 countries that have signed on.
Yes, including both developed and developing countries. Now, the targets that they've signed up to would not get us to the 2-degree target. They would get us to perhaps 3 degrees instead of business as usual, which would be somewhere close to 5 degrees by 2100. So it gets us the beginning, the start of the way. I would say the biggest success was the head of state participation. Over 110 heads of state there and negotiating directly themselves. Because of the failure of the legally binding negotiations, the negotiators unable to come to agreement, heads of state jumped in at the end, and they themselves, fighting for their positions, created much more political longevity, I believe, to what was agreed there. Without them, they would have just been making statements. They wouldn't have had that commitment personally, and I think that's what's key for ongoing success.
Bill, your book points out the different blocks that were sometimes working together, sometimes not at the meeting. So when I ask success or failure, you might be able to view it through the prism of the least developed nations, the countries like Brazil, India, and China, the U.S. What's your assessment?
Well, sort of bridging those two, the assessment of the whole thing and the various blocks forming, we talk about it as a useful disappointment. And I think useful in that, while from a top-down perspective and certainly staring at the science 40 years out of where we need to be by 2050, I share Richard's view. It was a failure. We didn't get a sort of cap on carbon that we need. But I think if you understand this as both a multi-generational challenge and a political challenge, Richard Gephardt has described this as the most complex political transaction in the history of mankind. Think about the crazy politics of healthcare that we went through for a year in the United States and multiply it by 192 and get those 192 countries to regulate 1/6 of their economy in the same way that healthcare is 1/6 of economy or energy is 1/6 of our economies. That's really complicated. And what we think a better way to think about it is a more bottom-up approach, looking at what's realistic, what you can accomplish right now in some key countries. And what you can't accomplish through the UN. It's hard to negotiate in the G192. There are at least 6 or 7 countries as a bloc that want to stop any progress at all. So what was actually, I think, useful at Copenhagen was there was an agreement amongst industrial and developing countries in rough terms about what they were willing to do domestically in the next, both over the course of 40 years, what our target should be for temperature, and in the near term, what they would do to reduce. And everybody understands that after that near-term reduction of 2020, emissions have to come down more dramatically after that. So what we found was the emergence of a block of countries that were willing to act, not just the 130, but really the core 4 major players, the US, EU, China and India. That was a step forward and one that didn't get very much attention or acknowledgement.
Does what happened at Copenhagen call into question the whole idea of trying to get a planet-wide consensus on a policy? I mean, that's what the UN process tries to achieve, but it...
Yeah, I think, the idea is still, it's like, Plato's vision of ideas as the sort of goal that you can never accomplish in reality. The idea should be out there. It's something we should still be striving for. You can get a long way toward the idea with just a few actors. It's the McKinsey rule of management. 80% of the problem can be found, or 80% of the solution can be found in 20% of the problem. If you just look at those 4 countries that I listed, that's half the world's population. It's 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. You add another 12 countries to those 4, and you get about 75 to 80% of the emissions. So, there's still obviously another 180 countries that you have to bring into it, but by chipping away at the big actors, you get a lot of the work done.
Aimée?
I would just say that one other additional benefit of the UN process is to maintain that moral commitment overall that this is a top global priority for heads of state to be addressing, and you have the most vulnerable countries in the room. And I would say that the President of the Maldives played a critical role in Copenhagen to bring everyone together to keep that moral pressure on. And the fact that he was willing, he was key, because he came in towards the end and said he was willing to agree to that target, which dooms his country. He's going to go underwater, and he has the most powerful quote about, we can move, but where will the butterflies go? Where will the colors go? Where will the sounds go? I mean, just incredible man. But his moral leadership to step in and say, I'm willing to agree to something because we have to get started now. So I would just say without that, if you only do the major economies, you lose those moral voices.
I'm afraid I'm going to repeatedly be a kind of glass is half empty kind of guy on this. But I think we have to look at some of the nations that are in the room, as it were, from the standpoint of their interests, and it's really tough to make the case to some nations that this is a good idea. Take Russia, for example, world's foremost oil producer, world's foremost natural gas exporter, has the world's second largest coal reserves, hardly even a token renewable energy industry. This is a nation that is not prepared for a transition away from fossil fuels. Other major fossil fuel exporting countries, rich ones like Kuwait or Canada or Australia, poor ones like Nigeria or Angola, these are countries that are going to find it from an economic standpoint very, very difficult to agree to any kind of emissions cuts, because it basically means using less fossil fuels. And that is the basis of their economy.
So it's irrational for them.
It's economically irrational. Now, you have an exception in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, who is interested in climate legislation, even though his country is a big fossil fuel exporter. It might have something to do with the fact that his country's oil production is declining, but it's an interesting exception to the rule.
I was just going to say that the Russians have just noted that they have an opportunity to save something around $80 billion if they address energy efficiency, because they have so much low-hanging fruit in their country. And so as far as their economic interests, I think we need to look more broadly than just where the energy productivity, the energy production side, but also the demand side.
Starting to move the discussion forward slightly, Richard, you've done some thinking about this. And Aimée mentioned the failure of Copenhagen in terms of what it was able to communicate to the wider public in making the case that we have to price carbon and making the case that we have to help poor countries deal with this. This is a case that would be made at a time in the developed countries of acute economic distress. You're going to go out to the public and say, oh, and we need to actually transfer a lot of money to faraway places to deal with that. You think that's a strategy that's doomed to failure?
Yeah, I do actually. From a moral, ethical standpoint, there's a very strong argument to be made that the already industrialized countries should pay for the energy transition in the world's less industrialized countries. But the hard reality is that the world is stuck in the middle of an economic crisis, and I'm one of those who believes that we're not at the end of the crisis, that we're not in the midst of a recovery, and we'll all be back to, 2007 levels of productivity in 6 months. We may be at the beginning of a very long period of economic contraction. We may have hit the limits to growth that have been talked about since the early 1970s. And if that's the case, then if people in the United States and in the EU and Canada and Australia, countries like that, are seeing their pensions evaporating and so on, it's going to be a really tough argument. But what should global equity look like anyway? I mean, is it realistic to plan for the entire world to become industrialized in the same way as the existing industrialized countries, if it's actually, as I believe, going to be very difficult for the world's industrialized economies to maintain the kind of economy they already have? Doesn't it make more sense to leapfrog the fossil-fueled industrial paradigm altogether and focus especially on the low-hanging fruit, like transitioning away from slash-and-burn agriculture to eco-farming, helping people in very poor countries avoid burning wood, dung, and charcoal for heat when we have things like solar cookers, very low-cost technologies that could be deployed very rapidly, scrapping old, inefficient, hand-me-down diesel vehicles and power plants in poor countries. These are the kinds of things that could be done cheaply and rapidly without the kinds of enormous transfer of capital that have been discussed in some occasions.
Bill, I wanted to ask you, so they come up with an accord, and it's not what had been hoped. You have China, you have Russia, India, Brazil as part of that accord, and then more and more countries have signed on. But you have the U.S., and you have a dramatic account in your book of Obama's role, like his actual, the man himself barging into this meeting. But another shoe has dropped in the United States. We pushed an accord, and yet last week the climate bill sort of vanished in the night. Mm-hmm. Does that change the entire discussion? It seems like it might.
It does. I mean, I think the core idea behind an accord as opposed to a treaty is that countries pledge to do domestically, and the enforcement of the agreement happens within those countries as opposed to between those countries. And there are ways of linking them, and we talk about that in the book, but it turns the nature of the negotiation on its head. We're negotiating to do stuff, and we're going to enforce ourselves. And the failure to pass a U.S. cap, as opposed to even a global cap, undermines that to a large degree. What I think is likely, when David and I were talking at breakfast this morning, I hadn't had my required double espresso. And now that I've had it, I'm a little bit more optimistic, because what I think, partly because of, at least in the next set of years, because of the fall off in economic growth, it's going to be easier to keep our emissions down. For years, people in industry claimed if you put a cap on emissions, it's going to shut down the economy. Well, it turns out if you shut down the economy, it helps lower emissions a little bit. It's just a reality. And a number of things that the administration already has done, an enormous amount of spending and regulations on, enormous amount of spending on energy efficiency and clean energy, alternative fuels, and new EPA regulations on cars. And now EPA still has the authority to regulate at least stationary sources of greenhouse gases. And are likely to exercise it to some degree. Now there's an opportunity there, and there's also a challenge there, because the one thing that the failure of the legislation says in the United States is that the Obama administration hadn't forged the bipartisan consensus needed to do this. We all know the math, you need 60 votes in the Senate. There were a number of Democrats that opposed it, so you needed some Republicans. They weren't able to bring those Republicans in. If you move forward and use the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases, to meet that Copenhagen Accord target, you undermine, that's going to be seen by a lot of moderates and conservative Republicans as undermining political a political desire to move forward. In other words, you could do it by administrative, executive branch fiat, or you can do it through the legislative process. So either way, there's a path to getting to the 17% number that could be started in the next few years. And the big choice after the midterm elections is, does the administration just do it by executive authority, or do they figure out some way of working with the Congress? It's a big challenge. I'm not as pessimistic as I was at 7:30 this morning, but I can't say that I'm above a 50-50 line of being optimistic.
Amy?
I would just say it's an incredibly dangerous time because I think a lot of people think, okay, the Senate has stepped back and it's kind of status quo, but actually the forces against action on this are aggressively moving forward, both in California and at the national level, to roll back EPA's ability and California's ability to move forward on regulating.
Do people know that in
greenhouse gas
California
emissions.
there's a ballot initiative this fall, is it?
Yes, it's to have a timeout for California's global warming bill. So it sounds good. It says basically we need to not take action on implementing California's global warming legislation until California's unemployment levels move from where they are now, 12%, to 5.5% or below for 4 consecutive quarters. That's happened 3 times since the mid-1970s. This is basically going to stop. And as we've heard from Richard, our economic prospects aren't very positive. So this could be a very long delay and a stall in California. And Senator Rockefeller has already indicated he's going to be moving forward with efforts again at the national level to stop EPA's ability to move forward on regulating greenhouse gas emissions. Now, Lisa Jackson has absolutely talked about her obligation, her role under law. According to the Supreme Court, they reinforced that obligation under the Clean Air Act to regulate these emissions, and that she will continue. Her job is to protect health, protect our environment, protect all of us, and so she has an obligation to move forward. And I would just say the problem with that is her ability to do this doesn't get us to the 17% commitment we made. Well, according to World Resources Institute's report they released a few days ago, EPA's regulatory authority begins to get us part of the way if they really aggressively move forward on enforcing it. So I just think we're at a very dangerous time. Oh, I'd say from the economic perspective, business perspective as well. At Google, I lobbied for AB 32, and our message was this is about the industries of the future. And same with an organization called the Clean Economy Network. We've had hundreds of business leaders on Capitol Hill from the clean tech, the green business communities saying, you just invested vast billions of dollars, 40 to 80 billion, depending who you talk about and how quickly the money's moving out, but in supporting these new technologies in America, leading on clean energy, and you're going to have a cliff when those stimulus dollars run out. You're going to go back to the $8 or $9 billion a year that DOE spends, where China's spending $8 to $9 billion a month on supporting these industries. And so there's a cliff post-stimulus if you don't have the cap in place, both money from the allowances of selling the allowances, but also the utilities bringing forward their investments to keep these technologies coming to market. So I just think it's a dangerous time.
You've worked with these companies, by the way. How are they feeling? These companies that have, one of them is a sponsor of this conclave here, Duke. Companies that have bet their future on there being something more than what we've seen.
Regroup, step back and regroup, incredible frustration because they're there trying to get a deal done and showing that we actually can move forward with something akin to a Waxman-Markey level target and the way that it was structured that would keep costs low for consumers, making that commitment, that we could do that for industrial users and get going on this. And huge frustration that it just felt like there was a complete lack of any ability to move votes on the other side. So, regroup. I mean, there's discussion about grenade throwing and all sorts of pretty robust campaigns against the other side. But yeah, it's a desperate time.
It's fascinating. So, Richard, what are we going to do? Just kind of wait till 2012, Kyoto runs out, and maybe there'll be the summit in a warmer spot, and people will move forward?
Frankly, I think the likelihood of a global binding agreement is pretty low for the foreseeable future. So I think we have to regroup and think of different strategies, think of different basic strategies. Part of that different strategy, I think, should be a recognition, and this needs to be pushed at all levels in terms of communication, a recognition that while during the 20th century fossil fuels were the route to economic growth and development, in the 21st century reliance on fossil fuels is fundamentally an economic, geopolitical liability. And the nations that are most reliant on fossil fuels are most vulnerable. And that's even the case with coal. Look at what's happening now in China, consuming 3 billion tons of coal per year. That's unsustainable, not just from an environmental point of view in terms of the climate impact. It's unsustainable in terms of the geology and economy of China. China is soon going to be importing coal in large quantities from Australia and Indonesia. But the total world coal export trade is only about 500 million tons. That means that China could absorb that with 3 years of economic growth. That means much higher coal prices globally are clearly in store, not over the long term by 2050, but over the short term by 2020. As fossil fuel prices inevitably increase, and dramatically so, this is going to pose a cap on world economic growth. And the only way to deal with that inherent cap imposed by the limits of geology is to explore other energy sources. The nations that do that first and most successfully will have the best chance of economic survival.
At the opening plenary this morning, I assume many of you would have been there. I think it was Jonathan Foley was trying to make a point about the preeminence of dealing with the agriculture and water challenge that the world faces, and it was a very vivid point. But he fascinatingly dismissed the fossil fuel problem. He says, well, we know how to solve our dependence on fossil fuel. We just got to deal with it. I just thought, since you're here on the panel, is it just you flip a switch, we'll take care of this?
Not so easy. My organization did a study last year, which is available on our website as free PDF downloads, called Searching for a Miracle, where we took 18 different energy sources and analyzed them across 10 criteria. And this is the first time this has ever been done, surprisingly. I mean, it's such an obvious thing to do, but most examinations of the energy alternatives look at only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 criteria. We looked at things like the energy return on the energy invested in producing a given energy source, location, scalability, and so on. And we found there is no credible route to replace fossil fuels on a one-to-one basis with alternative energy sources over the time period that matters. So the most likely future ahead of us is a future with less energy. And we should be planning for a world with less energy as well as very different energy sources.
Final comments before we open up our discussion to our...
I guess if my role is to be at least the somewhat optimist, I don't know if the glass half full, but it's there's something in the glass. Thinking about how far we've come in 20 years since the first Rio summit, you now have in the United States at least 50 votes in the United States Senate for putting a price on carbon. That's an extraordinary undertaking. I mean, when Aimée and I were working in the run-up to Kyoto, there was a meeting with Al Gore and the leading environmental groups, and they all said, we want you to pledge to a 20% reduction, and we want you to introduce cap-and-trade legislation. And he turned to them and said, how many votes have you got for that in the Senate? And they said, we got Wellstone. Then there was this sort of silent pause. And, you know, we have made an enormous amount of progress in the United States. Certainly in Europe, you know, we talk in the book about Europe as a country. Anybody that's watched the financial crisis over the last 5 months really has to wonder about that. But it turns out that on regulating for carbon and thinking about climate change, Europe not only has been a leader, but they actually have a common policy across the nations. Now, the challenge for them is to make sure that what happened in their financial issues and the challenges to unity don't also appear in managing this common bloc. But also in China and India, you have these countries both because, as Richard was saying, they look at the ecological crises that they themselves would face and are already facing. and because they're suddenly world leaders, and they realize that they're world leaders and that they can't step back. We saw just a couple days ago, and Tom Friedman had it in his column yesterday, but a number of us saw and were commenting on the news bulletin out of China Daily that China is now considering an emissions trading program. Now, they announced it in China Daily is that they're going to take on an emissions trading program. They're still working out actually what it would look like and when it would actually hit in the next 15 or 20 years. But that is an enormous change from those of us that watched in the negotiations as China and India threw up a roadblock at every turn. So, this is a multi-generational challenge. It is incredibly complicated, but we are making steps forward. And the question is, rather than looking at an end goal that we would implement today that would involve all 192 countries, over the next 5 to 10 years, what's realistic with the main countries that everybody's going to look to as leaders?
I would just say that domestically, I think this was both policy malpractice from walking away from this, because our lack of leadership on clean energy does, and our risk and vulnerability because of fossil fuels, it does continue to undermine our security, our prosperity, our health. These are issues that aren't going away. And so it's policy malpractice because we had a potential framework there where Duke Energy, the third biggest polluter in the country, had found a structure that he could actually work with and support and help get a deal done around. There was a deal to be made there potentially, I believe, with a little bit more leadership from within the Senate as well as a few other places. I would also say that politically it was malpractice because when you look at Frank Luntz's research, who's a Republican pollster, even in battleground states, over half of Americans support both accountability for polluters as well as the clean energy economy. And so it's just understanding how to talk to the public and how to shift the politics and have more leadership, more of a conversation with the public, I believe would help. I would also say farmers lose, and that was a huge missed opportunity where you have the agricultural community potentially benefiting from carbon offset markets under the House bill at least, and in the original Senate version of the bill. And yet the farming communities were worried about increased prices for oil, fossil fuels, the fuel that they use for their activities. And the private sector loses out also because of global markets. We don't have the U.S. stepping up and financing through our bilateral assistance agencies. We have not just AID, but you have the Export-Import Bank, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and other industrialized countries are pouring billions into supporting their companies getting into these emerging markets. Ours aren't, because we don't have that new income source from the sale of the allowances for the cap. So I just say there's some huge losses. I'd say two opportunities. Cancun, you could bind the Copenhagen Accord at where it was agreed to, make it legally binding, begin to move the early commitments of money of $30 billion of fast start money to help developing countries move forward. And you could also set up a monitoring and reporting and verification process to help make sure that we are moving forward on this. And then at the same time, we just had the Clean Energy Ministerial launch last week, which is a parallel process that Secretary Chu hosted. And it brought together the equivalent of 80% of the world's emissions around the table to talk about clean energy. What are the policies? What are the projects? What are the financing mechanisms that we can get started on to just get the work done? And then parallel continue with the global treaty negotiations. So I think there's some opportunities here.
Questions? Sir.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate what all three have mentioned, and however, my questions will be directed to Aimée. I mean, I've been hearing business and money and kind of commitments and so on. Is there kind of an ethical component of this whole discussion? Are there kind of ethical commitment from, let's say, polluters? There are certain people who've been polluting for the last 200 years, and there are people who just started polluting. So if you compare, for example, China and India to countries that have been industrialized for the last 200 years, is there kind of a differentiating kind of mechanism between the two, or all of them are being treated equal?
No, absolutely. The structure originally, actually it was really established in Rio in '92, where we talked about north-south differentiation in how the developed countries should take the first action because we've caused the vast majority of the problems around sustainability, and then the developing world would have time and support to help step up as well. And then under the Kyoto Protocol, it was the industrialized countries who were required to take binding commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then the developing countries would move forward with developing complementary policies that would help support action. And then the Copenhagen Accord has a similar structure where you have the industrialized countries saying, here are our commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, developing countries with really plans to reduce the rate of growth of their greenhouse gas emissions. But I would say back in the 90s, I was doing Latin American energy policy, and we negotiated the first bilateral agreements on climate change back then with Costa Rica, and then it spread out to Central America, Chile, Bolivia, Argentina. And their interests were in helping to finance renewable energy because they had more renewable energy resources than they did the fossil side. And so they were really seeing a business and development opportunity there. The challenge was the tool that was used to help finance clean energy under the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism, had a lot of problems associated with it. It wasn't efficiently staffed, and it was very politicized. And so they wouldn't want to approve projects that benefited Brazil, but so the Chinese on there, or vice versa. Anyway, so there is a very much a differentiated that the industrialized countries must go first, developing countries step up. But then now that China and others have really come in as middle players, there's much higher expectations for them. They can afford to take action, and there's expectations for them to absolutely do so. And China announced a national cap and trade plan for their next 5-year plan.
Bill, any thoughts on ethics and politics in the age of global warming? It's a subtitle.
Yeah, I mean, I take both a long view and a middle view off your question in addition to the short term. The long view is, in the book we talk about the fact that we are the first generation to know that climate change is happening. We're the last that has a chance to do something about it. And, you know, there is an intergenerational ethical component of this that overlays the North-South. The North-South one is both obvious and complicated. It's obvious that industrial countries have put most of the CO2 up there, although the deforestation question is an important and complicated piece of it, and that they should act first. It's complicated because as developing countries continue to develop and as they continue to grow, and their populations have been growing for some time, again, in the same way that industrial countries didn't know they were putting carbon up there, developing countries didn't know that the population growth that they were unleashing would continue to warm the planet into the future. So the North-South ethics are both obvious and complicated. The intergenerational ethics don't often get as much attention as they deserve. They're not any easier to sort through, but I mean, the real question I think all of us have to ask is, you know, my kids in 2050 will be exactly my age. They'll be 46 and 44, and I'm 45. And I want them to look back and say that when I was their age, that I had helped do something about it. Well, you know, there's going to be an entire planet of somewhere between 9 and 11 billion people, depending on who you ask. At that point, how are they going to look back at the 7 billion people that are around now and what we did about it?
Mr. Chair?
Thanks. This sort of plays off from what Bill just said. I was thinking this morning, listening about the debate that's going on about amongst geologists about whether or not we're entering this Anthropocene era. That in some ways, I think, you know, I want to raise the question to the panel, are we not at a point where we're moving to a new era and we have to sort of rethink how we're going to deal with a problem as big as climate change, and that the constructs that we used in the 50s to set up the United Nations, in the 70s to start thinking about the global environment, in the early 90s to start dealing with climate change, are they really appropriate in really dealing with this problem? And let me just point out, to me, you know, as Bill pointed out, when you talk about ethics, it's not just between the traditional divide between North and South, it's between one generation and another. But when you start talking about a problem like global warming, you start saying, for example, who's responsible for the CO2 emissions associated, or greenhouse gas emissions associated with the manufacture of these clothing? And is it the United States, because I bought it and wearing it? Or is it the New Zealand farmers? Or is it the Singaporean ship owners? It gets very, very complicated. I noticed just recently one of the countries that may be exporting coal to China is the United States. Is the United States responsible for those emissions when that coal is actually burned? It's very, very complicated. So the reality is, I question, you know, do we have to really start rethinking about how we approach this problem and recognizing that we no longer live in purely an international world, but an internetal world. What was the last word? Internet. of networks, that you have so many more stakeholders. You have communities, you have corporations, you have individual citizens, you have countries. And the reality is that, sure, it's an intergenerational problem, but if we look at the history of international environmental treaties, where they work, they've been extraordinarily slow. We don't have 40 or 50 years to make this transition. But I think many scientists tell us we have about 10 years. And so how do we create a dynamic in which, you know, people at every level of every society realize it's really important for them to start moving quickly towards a transition to a green economy? And the final point I would make is just with that is that I'm a little concerned that, you know, we decided in 1997 to start defining climate change as a giant air pollution problem for the planet. And I wonder, it's very convenient, it gives us some great metrics, but disguises the complexity of what we're trying to do, which is really to move towards sustainability, which is the subject of this particular conference. We have an opportunity, I think, to get ourselves into some better course over the next few years. In Cancun, we can really focus on what is truly international in the climate change problem, which is the monitoring and reporting. It's agreeing to transfers of technology and money. And then we're going to have an Earth Summit in 2012 in Rio, which will be an opportunity to look at all of these issues related to sustainability, because in some ways climate change is just one evidence of the unsustainability of our current systems.
Could I just say one thing about that? Sustainability is needs to be rigorously defined, and using renewable resources at a rate that the Earth can regenerate is kind of a really bottom line definition of sustainability. There are more parts to that, but one of the primary ways in which we're operating unsustainably as a species is we're drawing down the Earth's stores of non-renewable resources, burning them as quickly as we can, and then polluting the environment with the results. That's inherently unsustainable. It's not something that can be dressed up or through carbon capture and storage or mitigated. It's an inherently unsustainable mode of being on the planet. So sooner or later we have to address that, and actually it's not something we can put off any longer.
You had a question? Do you still want to?
Yeah. I had a question going back a bit to the Copenhagen process and to the process that's going to follow. I was wondering whether the panelists think that a strategy, because you were discussing a bit earlier what strategies we should follow in the next couple of months, whether a strategy might be to break up the issue of climate change into smaller issues. Like, for instance, one issue would be technology transfer and the potential creation of, you know, the global R&D facility and R&D in general. Another issue would be I don't know, emissions trading and how to do it, whether it's the CDM or whether it's something else, and whether, you know, taking aside and assuming that governments do want to cooperate and do want to have an international, some form of cooperation, but whether that shouldn't, you know, be broken down into smaller pieces. And in Europe, for instance, I recently attended a meeting with the European Commissioner on climate change, and she was saying that at Cancun, the expectation of Europe is not even to have a binding accord and a legal accord. They care less about the form, they care less about the legal issues, because this is where one of the north-south divides is strongest. And the voice of the European Union is saying something more or less, let's agree on fundamental substance. And I was wondering whether you think that this perhaps dilution of the subject into smaller pieces wouldn't be a solution.
I think the challenge with doing that is the benefit of keeping everything on the table is that you're able to make different trade-offs among the parties. I do believe you absolutely have to have these. They already have working groups on some of these issues around technology transfer, for instance, and so need to dig into the work between now and then. How are we going to structure? What does the financing commitment look like? What are the mechanisms that we're going to use to help move that money, and get into how we might also move forward on the area of forests. People feel like there is a potential consensus there on valuing forests. I think it's still highly complicated. But I agree with you in a need to dig into the substance, but I'm not sure that I think you then need to come back together and negotiate on a broader basis in order to have trade-offs.
Let me take a stab at it. I think I'm along the lines of where Aimée is, but here's the challenge. When you when you bring 192 countries together, you have the opportunity to raise the profile on the big issue. And the value for each of the sub-issues of raising it on the big issue is both the public attention, the moral pressure on the big actors, but also if you can get closer and closer to policy action in the big actors, you're going to get a price on carbon, and that's going to drive all the other stuff, right? It's going to drive technology transfer, it's going to drive emissions trading, it's going to drive resources for adaptation in the developing world. All of that will happen to the extent that you either get a global price in Richard's global binding agreement or 5 or 6 big actors having their own domestic binding thing. That price signal is driven by once a year, once every couple years, getting together and having a big noise, a big global rock concert essentially that drives public attention. And people only believe the big noise if they think it's going to create some action. But the extent to which we keep going back to this key thing and keep failing, people no longer believe the big noise. And so that's the challenge that the negotiators are playing with. And I think my own sense is if you can focus on the domestic action in the big places and people coming to the big meeting and reporting what they've done as opposed to the meeting browbeating them for what they haven't done, you have the potential to create a virtuous cycle as opposed to a downward spiral.
Give me just 1 second, but Strobe?
I just want to come in on the big noise point and what I think was one of the really perverse points and that had to do with the sidebar story that came out at the same time, known by the headline Climate Gate, East Anglia, IPCC, all of that. Over the last 20 years since Rio, one thing you could count on in these big rock concert meetings was that you get 2 favorable sidebar stories. One was all these enthusiastic NGOs in there applauding. Well, in this case, the sidebar story about the NGOs was that they were all there freezing outside and were really angry, both about not being let inside and what was and wasn't happening inside. But much more damaging was the burst of stories about the East Anglia emails, the Himalayan glacier article and so forth and so on. And in this country, at least, there was a direct correlation between what had been a steady upward rise in public acceptance of the basic case with regard to climate change and a sudden downturn in that polling. Well, I think it was back in March, we saw some polls of that effect, and it would almost certainly cause an effect. The point is, I think, that one of the critical roles that remains for the UN, even as it's supplemented by other, in terms of mini-lateralism, or whatever you want to call it, is that it is the universal validator and coordinator of the science, and needs to do a better job. I mean, I happen to think that the bad stories were both planted and exacerbated and exaggerated and demagogic to a fairly well, but it worked. And they had something to work with. And making sure that the IPCC doesn't wander towards the margins of the idea in the future is real important.
And there'll be another panel that probes into some of the climate gate stuff, among other things, tomorrow. You've been very patient, gentleman in the front.
One thing that just we have been talking when we talk about climate change and then this reached Copenhagen, I think it's the decisive role played by big actors, basically big actors, and even the north-south divide. You talk about is between big actors of the south versus vis-a-vis big actors of the north. But we forget to see that there are south-south divide also. Mm-hmm. That has been actually totally ignored in the whole process. As you mentioned that just when the possibility of signing a binding accord is very little in an immediate future. But and we are talking about at the same time to explore for alternative resources, energy resources for compensating during this transitional period. But there has to be, and there needs again agreement among these big actors, as to what areas has to be touched, and how to explore those areas, so that it will be equally divided. And one area that my question, is we have really, there are some potential big energy powers, even smaller countries. Just I give you one example like Nepal, for example. It has a potential of generating 83,000 megawatt of hydropower run out of water system, And there had been very little interest or little exploration or little knowledge, in the big actors, among the big actors, discussing how to support, to expedite these alternative sources from smaller nations, even like Bhutan, Nepal, and similar countries, Probably if that could be really expedited, then it could really help if the market, for Nepal cannot consume all these, 83,000 megawatt of water, the hydropower, the market will be the bigger, either India or even China. So what stops bigger nations of the north and south actually to explore and agree on supporting other alternative sources where, which can be immediately used,
An overlooked resource?
Absolutely, but I think it's actually now starting, that work, that collaborative work to help develop those resources and help figure out what are the best policies, technologies, operational practices, and financing mechanisms to help get that to happen. That's what this Clean Energy Ministerial that Secretary Chu hosted last week, that's supposed to be the beginning for that. And they launched some collaborations, multi-country collaborations, as well as the private sector being involved in those collaborations, and everything from renewable energy to smart grid to energy efficiency in both industrial and commercial applications. So that's the real practical joint work. What works, how do we get it done? And I think it also builds trust. In the 90s when we were doing the Latin America work, so much of that was about building trust, but it was also about creating a common interest around clean energy. It benefited their development needs, it benefited our business opportunities of collaborating in their markets. So I think there is a big opportunity there. And I would just say the big gap has been historically the lack of private sector involvement in the global negotiations, and this Clean Energy Ministerial helps bridge that as well. Last week, they had the first formal interaction between the actual negotiators and the private sector that the World Business Council on Sustainable Development and the International Chamber of Commerce, under the auspices of the UN Framework Convention, got together to talk to each other, literally for the first time, to understand what is it that they need from that global framework to help business develop these technologies.
You had a question.
The big issue too, as we look at all of this, is water. One of the more immediate impacts that obviously climate change has had is water. And one of the biggest issues facing our globe while we're trying to reach consensus is the security issues associated with water, shared watersheds, India, Pakistan, Israel, Jordan. Now we've got Egypt, having issues, on the Nile, which was, unprecedented before. So when we really look at the whole energy-water nexus, and we look at the fact that the most immediate impact right now of climate change is water and related water shortages, and there is no substitute, how does this factor? I mean, how do we start tackling something that is more immediate than the impact, the long-term impact of warming?
I think do you want to talk?
Well, the two problems are closely related in ways that make actually both problems more difficult to solve, because many of the alternative energy sources that nations are turning to are very water intensive. As the glaciers melt, that means less water flowing through rivers, through hydroelectric turbines. That means more electricity shortages. There are 100 nations in the world now with shortages of electricity on a routine basis. And part of that is a result of rivers drying up. And then we use an enormous amount of energy to move water around. In California, for example, the single largest use of energy in the state is simply to move water for irrigation. So as we have less energy to move water, and as we have less water to produce energy, we are really looking at a contracting human system. And that, again, we need to be planning for that. Obviously, we have to address the climate problem in and of itself to deal with what's causing the glaciers to melt. But that even if we did everything we could, as quickly as we could, the reality is that we have put so much carbon in the atmosphere that we will be dealing with water problems for the rest of the century. So looking at population and taking population stabilization as making that a serious international issue is extraordinarily important, because water, like all of these other water and energy, become much more difficult problems to solve if there are 11 billion people as opposed to 7 billion people. Is just part of the change in thinking that needs to happen in terms of planning for contraction.
And I would just note that water, why it's different from carbon, obviously, is that it's very much local in nature. And so whereas carbon, we can have this global treaty process, with water, it's much more, we need to address it on a regional, local basis. And I think, as a note, the southeastern U.S. relies tremendously, the vast majority of their energy is electricity is from nuclear and coal, which does require so much water. And so we did see those brownouts during the drought in the southeast. And Southern Company, the utility from that region, has been one of the biggest obstructionists to action on climate change. And yet they're going to be dealing with this going forward. I would just say that the Nile process of the water management of the Nile River, some folks have trotted out as one process where you brought together countries that relied on a common resource, and as a potential model that some have turned to address it on a regional and local basis. But then also interesting public-private collaboration starting, because Coca-Cola has made this commitment to move to water neutrality and is investing in watershed restoration in the local watersheds where they're pulling water out of the aquifers for their water consumption needs. And that's, clearly driven by outrage locally that they're taking what should be a public resource for private use, but this is something that they're trying to address on a local as well as a global basis. So some interesting innovations.
So playing the role of the somewhat optimist on the panel, you mentioned all those places where there's conflict, and what Aimée said about water always being local, whereas carbon's hard to imagine and it's out there. It drives politics in places, and it drives people to talk. When you listed all those potential hotspot war zones, you didn't mention Utah, Nevada, with Pat sitting next to you. But Pat's in the middle of probably one of the most difficult political near-war challenges in the United States. The Nevada National Guard, I think, is going to go across the borders any day now.
Just change out the government.
But it drives people to, well, there's that. It drives people, water does drive people to action. It drives politicians to action. It drives corporations to action in a much more meaningful way, I think, than carbon does. And I think the question is, how can you move that? We tend to think about fresh water, but I think what we've seen in the Gulf crisis is all kinds of water. The implications are pretty profound.
We did it through water, even when we went to the Gangotri Glacier in the Himalayas. We connected that water to downstream agriculture and connected that to food security. And the audience seemed to respond. The last two questions are going to go 1-2. So I haven't forgotten you, sir, but you're first.
Thank you. Thank you all. I wanted to speak to the leapfrogging idea that Richard Heinberg brought up. And I want to just ask you all, if we went with, say, an example. It's like when, say, you're trying to do something, you need a demonstration. I feel the intergenerational gap is that we don't have a vision of what a post-carbon society looks like. So we need visions. And what about a leapfrog? Where is there a way to invest in a country that has not gone industrial yet, or as little as possible, given the impacts that have already spread so widely? Can we invest in that as an example and develop them into a vision of a green economy? What does a green economy look like where we don't have depletion and extraction, right? And we actually start to demonstrate a repletive economy where people are somehow benefited, remunerated, for making things better long-term instead of short-term profit. Because we don't have a demonstration of what a truly repletive economy looks like, and we don't have a demonstration or a vision of what our lives look like without all this energy. So I wanted to bring that.
Can I take that? It's a really good but hard question, because when you look at what it takes to go post-carbon, there there are so many dimensions of it, right? There's energy production and energy consumption, and each of those breaks down into different ways. So there's energy efficiency issues that you want to demonstrate to a next generation. There's the production of energy, which they may or may not see. But again, I am somewhat optimistic here. I've got a 8-year-old who loves to yell at me when I turn on the air conditioning in my Prius because I'm harming the environment, right? So she knows at 8 that there's some connection between how we're using energy and which car we drive. And she goes to the public school. She really doesn't have much of a sense of what I do. I think it's only from actually having written the book where she sees her name in the inscription and, okay, maybe you are connected to this in some way. She just gets in the car and starts yelling at me when I turn on the air conditioning because she hears it at school. And she sees it on the consumption side. She sees it on the production side. When she sees a windmill, she knows that that's a good thing. And it doesn't have to be a modern windmill. It can be an old windmill. So I think some of these messages do come through, but they're pervasive. They go across the economy as opposed to one big demonstration thing.
Well, who would be a candidate for the winner of the Best Practices Country Award? Like Costa Rica or something?
Yeah. I was just going to say, Jacob Shearer and his team at NRDC have been working with Costa Rica on their carbon neutral commitment. And so absolutely, as well as the small island states have made commitments to go carbon neutral, to walk the walk that they need the rest of the world to do. But I think that with vision, there's kind of 3 aspects to it. There's the feasibility, really knowing that it is cost feasible, technology feasible to take this on. And that's some of the work that McKinsey's done with low carbon growth paths on a country by country basis helps towards that. But the neurobehaviorists out there, I've been doing this climate-minded behavior project, say that you actually need to also see yourself in that future. It's just what you're talking about. And so there's a couple of efforts. There's a kind of Futurama 2.0. What does the next generation of this country look like? And get people to actually see what does that look like in their cities and their communities. There's also 4 Years Go, which is a global campaign for all of civil society, private sector to work towards basically creating a sustainable future, and they're working on a visioning process as well to show people what that looks like. And then finally, it's the iconic cases like a Costa Rica, but also some of us talking about Haiti and what is the opportunity there, given it was the poster child for how environmental degradation undermined everything, security, safety, to their economy, of course. And so we have $9 billion about to flow into Haiti. How do we make sure that we help them rebuild green with reforestation, key to that, but then also on the energy side, not go to the traditional markets where they'll be handcuffed to the coal and oil markets that they don't have at home.
We need examples at all levels of scale, countries, but also towns, cities, neighborhoods, and here in the U.S., we need in every city a suburban home where the people who are living there have turned their home into an example of how people can, super insulated, solar hot water, solar PV, growing vegetable garden in the front yard, et cetera, et cetera. There's the transition town movement that's, catching on like wildfire all around the world. It's a grassroots movement transitioning away from fossil fuels. Hundreds of towns and cities that this is happening in. So, yeah, we need models at all levels of scale to show people not only that this can be done, but how to do it.
You're very patient. Do you have a question that still fits with the flow?
I've done a lot of work and a lot of reading, and I've listened to everybody talk here, and I hear about how the future will bring us to nirvana. When the population of the world will eventually understand that climate change is here and we need to do something about it. I guess I'm somewhat of a pessimist in that I believe that man will ultimately destroy man. And I wonder what we're doing, what this panel thinks about adaptation versus climate change. Because I don't think politically, I don't think from a green point of view, I need to say that man in its largest context will change. I think we're doing a lot at the margins, but what are we going to do to adapt to Richard Heinberg's concept of there isn't enough alternative energy to make us live in a non-carbon society. So what does mankind do? What does this panel think about the adaptation to what that future will bring, which I think will probably where we will be in 2050. We're all talking about 2100. I think it's 2030 at the rate that Greenland is melting. And all the ice sheets around the world. You know, I live in Florida. I live on a barrier island. 13 feet from my house is water. And I know where that water is going to be in my grandchildren's life, in my house. Because I know that the ice is going to continue to melt no matter what we do today to change that carbon emissions, because the carbon is already up there at 385 to 400. And that's going to stay there for the next 1,000 years.
Well, how does the panel feel about embracing men and women's darker nature and just start on more vigorous remediation efforts? Aimée, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think it was John Holdren who said we're going to be doing 3 things to address climate change: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. And the more you mitigate, the less you have to adapt and suffer. And we're already at a point where we know we're going to have to adapt to some extent and suffer, as we're already suffering. So given that, well, first of all, I would take issue with your statement that you don't think that there's enough renewable resources to actually live without carbon. I think that solar has that potential. But given where we are, I think that with adaptation, what's the most interesting and promising area here is really about the role of nature in helping us by restoring our natural systems to help us to adapt. That's going to be the best long-term adaptation strategy and the best cost-effective adaptation strategy. So right now you have certain senators in Louisiana and elsewhere who just want to build a massive levee. That's just what they want to do. It's going to be the grand levee, and they're working in portions to get pieces of it built. Whereas there are others who are saying that, you know, fundamentally you can't do that. That won't work. Nature will win, and you have to restore the wetlands and the river system to do so. In fact, Secretary Babbitt, we were speaking about this last night, about what that could look like. So he's a great resource on this. But I think with mangroves, we've seen the co-benefits of mangroves as both carbon sequestration, nurseries for fish, as well as bearing the brunt of the storm impacts. And as so it's going to have to be a combination, but I think that nature and understanding the value of nature and pricing it is where we need to be going. And carbon is just that first ecosystem we're having, the atmosphere's first ecosystem we're having to deal with, but the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment made very clear that because 2/3 of the world's ecosystems are already degraded, we aren't able to reach the Millennium Development Goals because we rely on nature to provide all these free services, and it's too expensive to do what we need to do without nature. So we need to get back to valuing water, carbon, pricing externalities. And the World Bank's doing some interesting work on green GDP accounting, which I think is a good start.
Richard, any final thoughts on this or anything else as we head off to lunch?
Yeah, well, nature will solve all the problems for us. Famine will solve the problem of overpopulation. Economic collapse will solve the problem of greenhouse gas emissions. As we've seen over the last 2 years, the problem is that nature will solve these problems in ways that are unacceptable. And it is what all of us are trying to do is to steer this process of change and adaptation. That the end goal is more or less inevitable. We will have a society in 100 years where we are living with renewable resources harvested at a sustainable rate. But will that be 100 million people on planet Earth living in devastated ecosystems, or will it be something that looks a lot better and more attractive than that? So the more we can possibly do, the better. Since these are my last words, I would just, on this subject, I would just mention something that hasn't been talked about, which is what could be accomplished in terms of carbon sequestration in soil. Soil is an enormous carbon sink on this planet, and we have been releasing carbon from soil through our agricultural practices over the last 10,000 years, actually, but especially over the last few decades. And there's enormous potential to sequester up to half and perhaps even more than half of the amount of carbon we're emitting into the atmosphere through changing our agricultural practices. We need to do that anyway because the fossil fuels that we're using for industrial agriculture are going away. So this should be a major subject of discussion when climate comes up, transitioning our entire food system so that we are sequestering carbon instead of releasing it.
Bill, some final thoughts?
So one thought in response to that, and then two final thoughts more broadly. The thing that I think is understudied in this regard is migration. I mean, the way people will adapt as they move. You know, think about the, you know, in American public schools, the better way, if you're just purely focused on cost benefit, the better way to fix your kids' school situation is to move to a district with better schools. And that's what people are going to start doing on climate. So people from Florida are now vacationing in the mountains of western South Carolina and North Carolina. You know, real estate values continue to rise there, even in the economic thing, because hurricanes and other coastal related things are just making that making where you live too sketchy a retirement proposition. And we've all seen migration in the Southwest, but then we're going to be seeing migration across the border as places like Mexico and further south become harder to inhabit. The other big opportunity area, somebody, I think maybe Richard had touched on it before with respect to rural cooking and things like that, but the idea of black carbon as the underexplored thing. I mean, we're talking about the post-Copenhagen. Black carbon causes global warming. It is not a gas. It is particulate matter, and therefore it's not regulated under the Rio-Kyoto process. But it's a huge opportunity because it forces not just global warming, it forces the melting of glaciers, and it's really low-hanging fruit. It's very cheap. So I think that that's actually an opportunity moving forward. And then just sort of coming back to the topic of post-Copenhagen, I think for as people do the sorting out and stock taking that Aimée was talking about that's happening at the corporate level in the United States, thinking about these next 2 or 3 global meetings as focusing on realistic, local, practical solutions and setting expectations for a global confab in some midterm period, 3 to 5 years, where you come back to the global deal once the U.S. and other countries have figured out their domestic politics a little better. There is an awful lot of low-hanging fruit, whether it's, you know, water resources in Nepal or black carbon, or wrapping your mind around the migration challenges ahead from a scientific standpoint. That's where I see things going in this next period.
Amy, any final thoughts? No, you actually started our period of wrapping up. I started out by talking about Kurt Vonnegut, and remember he was downbeat, too late, yet he had this joie de vivre, so I tried to resolve it as that interview proceeded. I kept trying to sort of come back and resolve how can you be so engaged when you feel it's already over. Finally he said, what makes life worth living is joining a gang. And I said, you better speak more precisely than that. And he said, people who come out of their homes, come together to work with a common purpose on big issues. That's what makes life worth living. So I think we have a gang here, and I appreciate all your input on the panel today. Enjoy your lunch.